Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's so nice to see you all in good health after 1 month's summer vacation. Before we begin, I would like to introduce the participant here this morning. We have Mr. Rolf Theodor Schuster, who is Deputy Ambassador of German embassy here in Seoul. He is actually an economist by training, so he will be with us in future meetings. Welcome to Korea and joining us in this. And also we have actually National Assemblyman Mr. Lee out of his busy schedule at the National Assembly. 우리 이재용 의원입니다. But we have many guests, but I don't want to recognize individually. Well, we have a very special guest speaker this morning from Japan, our good friend, Professor Yukiko Fukagawa, who is a professor at the Waseda University. In fact, she had been with us many times before, so I don't think I need a long introduction for her to this audience. But she used to teach at the Tokyo University, and now she moved to Waseda, and now I understand that she is on sabbatical, and she is now the visiting fellow at the Cambridge University in England. Professor Fukagawa actually studied and did research in Korea at Korea University and KIET, Korean Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade. Mr. Kim is head of that institute now. So she knows Korean economy very, very well, of course, in addition to Japanese economy. This morning, she will share her insights on demography and aging and the labor reform in Japan, which will have very important implications for Korea. As you know, the labor reform is one of important ingredients of so-called Abenomics. And so she will, I'm sure, will share with us what's going on with regard to the Abenomics in recent months, maybe during her presentation or during Q&A session. I'm sure after her presentation, she would like to entertain any questions, preferably in economics area. Well, I don't think I should waste any more time. Then with this, please join me in welcoming Professor Fukagawa.
네, 여러분 안녕하십니까? Good morning. 이런 자리에서 뵙게 돼서 반갑습니다. I'm very much happy to be able to come back here again. And always I've been enjoying the very good discussions with the participants in this meeting. And actually, I'm now living in UK, United Kingdom, as a visiting fellows. And actually, Japan is almost the only country that follows the European kind of system. And still we have maintained certain social democratic kind of ideas. And that's a very different atmosphere if compared to the rest of other Asian countries that follows the American system. So, but recently I've got a big interest on the aging process of Asian countries. And it's not actually only Korea. Japan is far advanced in terms of aging, but other countries, like even in Vietnam, Thailand, they are just following exactly what Korea has done. And so aging is a big issue. And I would like to concentrate on these issues and trying to combine the major topics in Abenomics, because we are the oldest countries in terms of demography. So even though we got so old, but still we are trying to grow something, otherwise we are going to be bankrupt anyway. So we've been very much serious this time on all kinds of reform. And okay, so that's going to be my presentation. So there are many discussions about the aging populations and the economic growth. So generally, what's going to be like in having such old people in a society. And I'll just mention about Japan's experience in the past, trying to compare the Korean aspect, because after all, I'm not expert on Japanese economies, but I'm more interested in Korea. And finally, I just try to adapt some Japan's recent growth strategies under the so-called Abenomics and its implications for Korea. And finally, I would really like to add some of the frontier for Japan-Korea relationship, because all the political relations is probably the worst after the diplomatic tie between the two countries. So we got to do something, and we've got to find out some common goal so that we can get on well, at least better than now. So that's my presentation today. So aging and economic growth, actually, there are many countries whose turns to be somewhat not positive about the future growth, even in the U.S. The so-called secular stagnation argument has been very popular after Professor Lawrence Summers mentioned about the potentials for the stagnations in the U.S. economy. And he's something mentioning about the structural issues like aging, even in the U.S. Well, from Japanese point of view, still U.S. is quite a young society. So if you talk about aging has already started to threaten our growth, what will you be able to do? So this was a kind of big shock for us. So we are still talking about these kind of issues, probably shared by many European countries. And other emerging economies even, some countries are suffering from a so-called middle-income trap, that like Malaysia, they are not so old in demography, but they started to feel something, limitations for their future growth, and other, especially the northeast countries, including China. So Korea may have a different story, but the big issues is we probably may go aging faster, maybe too fast. So these are like everybody has been talking about so far, so I just skip the theoretical part. And well, actually, there are many economic topics that can be related to aging. For instance, balance of payment. Usually, if your society's got so much aged and then you lose the investment opportunities, you try to go out. So then, that may probably something mitigates the continuous falling of the natural interest rate, but at the same time, you may suffer from deteriorating balance of payment, especially in trade. And another issue is, of course, if you are serious about the, well, after all, if you're aging, that means the labor input has started to slow down or even start to decrease, like in the case of Japan. And maybe since the input is getting smaller, we have to upgrade the quality. So naturally, if we added more qualities into the limited number of workers, probably that may boost the economy. Well, that's a typical argument, but actually empirical part of the studies is very vague. Some countries or sometimes have been successful, but some cases it didn't work. So we don't know. And another big issue is about the mature economies is, after all, is a pension reform. So if your input is limited, another issue is how to provide the better incentives for the peoples to keep working without solely dependent on the pension fund. And of course, if you can provide it with such a paradise kind of pension, you are always tempted to keep it just receiving. So the pension reform is always a big issue, and especially most of the countries' pension fund is under the big reform. So we have to stimulate the people to be something positive about keep working. And another issue is relations with the working age populations and the potentials of the bubbles. And probably most of you are quite familiar with the Japan's bubble collapse in 1990s after we started to see the old demographic changes. So there can be a lot of impact for especially the property market. That was the major issues. So how Japan has been experienced these kind of things? Well, there are many issues. There have been so many issues. One thing was the price. We suffered the deflation very constantly after the collapse of the bubbles, and many people have tried to relate the Japan's deflations with the demography. Just right after the collapse of the bubbles, many people are so busy about how to restructure the whole economies. So, but after that, many people have started to feel, oh, maybe we are too old to buy something, to consume something. So that's why the expectations for the companies or business people or even the consumers, the expectations for higher price is all gone. So that's why the price continues to fall. So that was a very popular argument. And another thing is, well, usually if you get older, you are probably more interested in consuming something different service, like a Medicare service, healthcare service. But the supply side adjustment, it tends to be very slow. So still the manufacturing, for instance, they tend to be just concentrated on the cutting edge technology, but the cutting edge technology based products tends to be more consumed, unfortunately, by the younger generation. Old people, we are not interested in a most fashionable wearable IT products or something. So that was the Japan's case. And the finance, there are many things. And of course, since the bubble was collapsed, the need for the housing investment shrunk very rapidly in Japan. And before that time, still in Japan, that probably should be very close to Korea, still everybody wants to get their own house. So the property, especially the housing investment, continues to grow, but it's all gone because, well, you can take over your parents' house anyway, as long as your parents don't live too long. So that's an aging society. And so then what will come to the older generation, it's cash. So people feel very scary about the future, and then they try to accumulate as much as cash. And that is another aspect that was very much talked about the aging populations. And also, especially if the people just continues to grow older, like Japan's speed, the pension fund is under the extreme pressure. And once you're so politically committed to the pension fund, it's very difficult to reduce it. So people are extremely unhappy about just giving up the vested interest. So pension fund has always been a big issue, but still that's also very much related with the aging speed. And another thing is local economy. This is very complicated issue in Japan. Whenever the election comes, the politicians are always screaming about how to revitalize the local economies. We have to shape up all the local economies and this kind of things. And the thing is, as you grow older, you tend to see more income gap in the older generations. But more than that, there should be an extreme gap between the local areas. Some areas, like Nagoya areas, which is led by strong global manufacturing, they're doing okay. Even though they are, well, demographically, we've been old, but still they can attract the young labor anyway. But the rest of others, especially the others who are totally dependent on the constructions or agricultures and those labor input kind of industries, they are very much going behind the Nagoya areas. So the politicians tend to be very keen about these issues. And balance of payment, and people have been always complaining, especially manufacturing, who tends to use the labor anyway. They try to go out of Japan because, well, after all, it's too expensive to have manufacturing, and that is going to probably happen in Korea too in the meantime. And it's not only the currency exchange rate, but it's more the labor cost or labor input probably. And so that's why we've been always talking about the Hollandization, that all the industries will be gone, and who's going to feed us. So that's another issue. And also trade balance. Well, the trade balance has been getting more, has been recording bigger deficit. But what is to compensate the deficit is the income coming from abroad. So that's why, even though, as I said, actually last time when I talked here, Korean media was very crazy about Abenomics, and they said Abenomics is going to ruin us because it's the measures to artificially lower the yen's exchange rate so that you can compete with Korea. But actually, it was not, and I confidently said in this talk that Japanese export won't grow that fast. And your competitors is not Japan anymore, and your competitors will be in China because they can still intervene into the exchange rate, and they are accumulating technology very rapidly. So as I said, I think my point was quite right, at least in this sense that Japanese industry won't be the competitors for Europe. So that's, well, maybe made in Japan products in Indonesia or made in Japan's products in China will try to compete with a made in Korea, but manufacturing is very much out of Japan already. So, so far, if we are, that's also related with the Abenomics issues because we are almost to see even the deficit in a current account. So unless people, the companies, the globalized companies, make a profit outside of Japan and send back the money, we are going to see even the current account deficit. And the current account deficit means since our budgetary, we are almost the biggest budgetary deficit, we are going under the strong market pressure by twin deficit. So that's an aging related also issue. But finally, after almost 2 decades of all the scattered around discussions, we seems to have reached certain conclusions that after all, the biggest problems of the aging societies is the smaller labor input. So smaller labor input means that your potential growth rate will be declined because the labor input has a limitation. So so we started to feel it, especially after the Abenomics first arrows and second arrows, and now we are very much feeling the labor shortage. And but it doesn't necessarily mean that we are, of course, desperate about getting out of deflation, but naturally the expectations, if you feel the labor shortage, the wage is going to adjust it. But still at this moment, big companies are quite cautious about raising up the wages so rapidly. So there are even the small SMEs are suffering from the labor shortage, and they have to compensate with the wages. So the wage is a crucial issue for Japan in terms of fully getting out of the deflations. So what we are doing is, under the Abenomics, is the labor reform that is already introduced. But the pressure for labor mobilities and political, there is a complicated relationship with the labor mobility issues and political labor protests, because, well, labor union-based politics always try to protect and protect and protect. So we have to pursue that. We have to improve the mobility, so the right people should go to the right place. But, well, of course, people feel so scary about losing jobs. So how to do it has always been the issues. And another issue is, since the labor input is small, we have to increase any kinds of input. So that means women's labor participations is the worst, almost worse, because Korea is worse than Japan, fortunately. So we are the second worst in terms of labor, women's labor participation. And finally, our government has started to be serious, and the business society has started to be serious because they feel it. So there's incentives to be serious about women's participation. And seniors, of course, the retirement age is, well, legally 65. And it's almost really 65, not like in Korea, so virtually it's 60, but you have to retire at the age of 50 or 55. So seriously, we have to extend the retirement age. So we have to use the seniors as well as foreigners. So that's a labor issues. And another thing is labor productivities. And as is well known, Japanese service sectors is still suffering from the labor productivities below the average of OECD members. So we've got to innovate the service sector, especially in SMEs and less globalized industries. So these are things that Japan finally concludes that what is the problems of aging society? The greatest issue is the labor input and the labor productivity. So, and probably it's going to be quite similar in Korea in the meantime. So now, actually, I'm in the real middle of the Korean baby boomers. So I know what will happen to Korea after our generations will just retire. So I think it's a matter of time. So what is the implications for Korea based on Japan's experience is probably one is the biggest constraint. It's going to be the labor input. So, but this is very difficult, especially the business people don't, unless they really feels that we are suffering from labor shortage. Well, like in Korea, still it's the feeling might be very different. It's more labor is abundant. And if you say that we are going to hire one person, probably very trained, very well educated, young people will try to get a job as long as it's a decent job. So, well, probably Japan used to be in that way. But after the baby boomers substantially retired from the market, the situations will be quite similar. But it's very slow. Well, even if you pass the law, but still the business is going to respond it and the market is going to respond it. It takes time until you really get it. So even right now, if Korea's tried to be serious about, for instance, women's labor participation, it takes time anyway. So my advice is, of course, you'd better do it much earlier than Japan. Especially the education achievement by Korean women is very high, so you've got to naturally make the best use of this resource. And also, another implication is, in an aging society, since the demand itself for the housing is going to decline, so that once the bubble collapses, the impact should be very serious. And that is going to, especially maybe even more Japan, the impact should be even bigger in Korea than Japan, because as far as I know, the portfolio of the retired people in these countries is very much dependent on the housing and property market. So, so the regional gap widens, and probably many companies try to get out from the home countries. And so this kind of thing, it looks quite doomy. And so what's going to happen in Korea? Probably aging is too fast. I think Korea has two issues. One is that aging is too fast. One is that the aging timing is not really good. And the aging too fast is a very common discussions already. And most of the issues is pension fund and Medicare services on the protections of the socially weaker peoples and social safety net. These are not be able to catch up well because the speed is too fast. And if you look at the Koreans' poverty research on the Korean poverty, it's very interesting that the very poor people in older generations is really concentrated on the typical patterns, just old people living alone without any support from the family. So maybe you have a good family, you'll be okay. But if you're abandoned by your daughters or son, you're going to suffer. But usually in other mature economies, the pension fund is going to support those because they cannot do anything. So, pension fund, one is pension fund issues, and also the labor, low productivities, low productivity labors by aged people because, well, after all, if you don't have pension, you have to work longer to sustain yourself. So that is why Korea is working longest among the OECD members, even in their 70s. And keep working itself is not necessarily a really sad thing. So Oriental culture, well, especially men's, are always try to be participating something, unlike ajumas or unlike women's. So probably, but well, there's a fact that still very poor people who's very desperate about their own living. So we have to do something on it. So another thing is probably risk in the property market, and probably demographically, another sad thing in this country is there is a vicious cycle between the low birth rate. Korea's birth rate is lowest among in the world, and again, thanks to Korea's coming up, Japan became the second worst. So, but this is not a good thing anyway. So. And the government I think government has been serious on these issues, but actually the labor policies sometimes tends to be very much myopic, saying that the politicians is already committed to job creations in that level, so we've got to do something. But how the bureaucracy is going to do is to try to subsidize somebody, to put it into their certain companies or labor spot, and then they say, oh, we proudly say, oh, we created such a large number of jobs, but how it's going to be sustainable, we don't know. And younger generations tends to be sacrificed for it. And that is a typically Japanese kind of situations, because after all, in an Oriental society, or you're younger, or you can be with your family and you can stay your own home. And real issues is how to finance or how to keep the breadwinners working for you. So the younger generation tends to be sacrificed for the new job opportunities. And of course, women is very unhappy about these situations, and that's why people don't get married, people don't have children. So it's a vicious circle. So there are many things about Korea. Just the thing is that is too fast. I think, well, in Japan's case, when Japan entered into the so-called aging society, that was in 1970s. And the aged society, where the 65 above persons become the more than 7% of the whole populations, and that's an aged society. But between the aging and aged society, Japan successfully could increase the per head GDP from almost 19 times. But Korea's is too short, and it has only 18 years from the aging societies into the fully aged society in 2018. And it's coming pretty soon. But probabilities is maybe 3-4 times will be the probably the limit. So that's too fast issues. And this shows the household income between Japan and Korea. If you see that, well, Japanese older generations is very much financed by public pensions, while Korea's is almost nothing. And what stands out is the income coming from your own children or families. So if you don't have a good son or good daughters, you suffer. So that's Korean situations now. And otherwise, you have to work. So the green part is the working income. So, so still, Japanese older generations is quite spoiled in my sense. If you ask older generations, you are difficult in living, do you have difficulties in living? Most people are, no, I'm fine, I'm doing okay. It's the green part, and the green part is the largest in Japan, even compared to Sweden or Germany. And Korea's is the red and orange one is having a greater share. That means many people are feeling difficulties about living. So if you see the falls in household spending, in Korea, after you get 50s, the consumptions will drop very rapidly, and its speed is very very different compared with Japan, which is still subsidized by various kinds of pension funds. So Korean prospect, another thing is the aging timing, and this might be a bit new, probably the concept, and my sense is, one thing is that Korea has already started aging before you just converted from the technology input to innovation-led growth. And so if you don't make a success in just going to the innovation-led growth, there can be a very negative pressures, because the real resources for the younger innovators, or younger, especially the science and technology researchers, the absolute number is going to decline. So you can borrow, or you can even borrow the other human capital from abroad, but still, in terms of Korea's endogenous technology growth, you absolutely need those young laborers. And if you grow older, another thing is you can't take so much risk because you're old, too old. So no one wants to be very much interested in a very risky money. You have to make some efficient monetary intermediary so that you can produce the risk-taking money. So in Japan's case, it's not the bank, but it's more the general trading houses that is providing the risk money for the ventures, but even though that's very much limited. And another thing is that aging did come earlier in Korea at the time of modularization. In that sense, getting competitions with China is getting more and more severe. And protecting tacit knowledge has become more difficult. But finally, I believe that Korea has some kind of unexpected card anyway. Once North and South unifications go smoothly, that is going to provide the good enough labor for use, and all the property market will continue to grow, so everything will be gone. But the issue is that's too much more, if you make a 대박, that's okay. But if you don't have 대박, well, that's too risky. So this shows Korea's technology import and export. Well, you've been having a lot of export these days, but actually the combinations is not, it remains to be the same. In Japan's case, until you reach the aged society, Japanese technology introductions versus R&D investment is somewhere like 10% or 15%. That means Japanese technologies became very endogenous, but Korea is still importing a lot of technology from outside. So how you got to be innovative is a big issue. And but I'm not so much pessimistic about the Korean aging issues. There seems to be quite a hope still remains. And one thing is that actually, at this moment, if you become very serious about tackling with the low birth rate issues, you can fight back with the aging speed. So that's why I've been always stressing it's not only aging, but it's more the low birth rate that the Korea is going to suffer. So you have to make your younger generation happier. You have to let your young generation get married. And soon, as soon as they get married, they have to get children, at least 2 or more than that. Otherwise, you just follow the Japan style type of declining. So, but another thing is a high urbanization rate in here. Japan is very much scattered around. And how to make concentrations into a certain city functions is very difficult to do politically and socially in Japan. People just believe I have the rights to be treated equally, even though no matter how your remote place where you're living in, but still we have the rights to be treated equally with the peoples in our cities. How come? That's totally impossible. But the risk for the Korea seems to be smaller because it's already concentrated anyway. And also the housing, even the housing is very much concentrated in apartment. It's not an independent house. And the market making should be far easier. And another issue is in terms of pension fund, Korea is still at the small pay, smaller benefit society. So even if you add something, that is going to politically make people happier. But in Japan, it's accumulated too much, and people try to get out. People try to reduce the given vested interest. So that is going to be a huge political capital. So in that sense, there are many advantages for Korea. And also, since Korea is a very IT society, you have enough rooms to have the world's most sophisticated medical system, medical service system, using up all the IT informations, and also, well, it's getting something touchy, but it's since many people still continues to immigrant from here, their resistance for immigrants should be lower, probably psychologically, at least if compared to Japan. And also, what's nice about Korea is finally the better educated seniors. And this is a very contrast with China. China's older generations, the half of them are not really educated at all. So these are the Korea's advantages. So I just skip up and try to go to the final part. So the so under the aging, nevertheless, we finally realized what was the real issue on us. And we have now the 3 kinds of plans for the revitalizing the economy. One is revitalizations, so-called revitalizations of industries, and trying to get a better competitive industrial basis, and trying to, of course, promote innovations by SMEs and anything that's quite similar with Koreans. And the other thing is strategic market creations by the government through the deregulations or the market structure reforms in a domestic market, and other things is globalization, like free trade agreement and this kind of things. And So compared to Korea, we are taking quite a similar directions. Of course, everybody agrees that reinforcing the industrial bases matters a lot, and globalization, we desperately need the reforms. And since the real demand in the domestic market is declining, we got to find some demand anyway. No matter how it's on domestic market or outside of the market, for home market. And so that's why we have to be very desperate about it. And, but the progress seems to be quite different. Korea seems to be faster than Japan in terms of industrial restructuring and just reinforcing the location advantage, just cutting the tax or corporate tax, or the subsidies for the innovation and R&D activities. Actually, R&D spending in Korea is world's #1 in recent years. So in that terms, Korea is leading, but SME stock and external asset, Japan has a huge external asset that is still sustaining the economies, and the progress is very different. And also, approach is also very different. Japan is still depending on the domestic market, especially in terms of the resource for the innovation. Domestic market is very important for Japan. So what Japan is very serious is the medicals and healthcare service these days. And this is a serious issue because we've been spending so much on it. And if we can innovate these services efficiently enough, that is going to reduce the further burdens of the public budget. And also, it's going to be the innovation resources. And we tried to export this know-hows outside of Japan. And new energy or next generation infrastructures. And these are all concentrated on the domestic market. At least there's no exchange rate risk, and the market is very much, can be manipulated or created by the government deregulation speed. So, so by doing this, well, after all, we've started to feel that we are not only suffering from the labor input, but also in terms of we have to improve substantially the labor qualities. So these are the issues about Japan's. And I think industrial reinvestment plans, we are doing quite similar. And probably the difference is probably this one. We are very serious, of course, about how to make people healthier, because we are spending so much on it. And that was the thing that I was mentioning it. And these are 10 issues that is related to the growth strategy. So I think, well, it takes time because the real economy is something stickier than financial restructuring or the financial issues. But we are under the extreme pressure anyway, so we cannot postpone any kinds of reform anymore. Otherwise, the interest rate for the public funds will grow up and we'll just in fire. So we'll be serious. So if we just take the Y, like functions in this, we define the Y like this, what the Abenomics is trying to do is to increase K or returns to K. So we are serious about corporate governance. We are serious about the public pension funds reform, GPIF, because again, in this public pension fund, Japan's performance is worst from maybe third or fourth among the OECD members, and the worst is Korea. So thanks to Korea, we are getting number 3 or 4. So, but we are very serious, of course, in these issues, and encouraging entrepreneurship and corporate tax, and that's quite related to the K issues. And increase A, of course, if you're more efficient, if you're more productive, you can continue to grow. So innovation through science and technology, agricultural reform, because agriculture is a big black continent for Japan. So we've got to do it, and increasing ale. So that's why women, foreigners, seniors, and everybody have to work in Japan. So that's Abe's reform program. So, but I would like to just finally touch upon two things that might be the greatest implications for Korea. One is, after all, it's a labor input that is going to matter in an aging society in the meantime. So you have to be serious about women's, foreigners, seniors' participation. And what Japan is trying to do, there is a big tax disincentives for housewives to keep working. If you get more than 1 million yen or something more than that, you're going to be taxed. So no housewife is willing to work. So we are trying to abolish this one. And this kind of tax incentives can be politically decided anyway. And another thing is how to diversify the working conditions and way of working. And since the Japanese businessman's traditional working styles is quite similar in Korea, you stay long in the office, trying to see what your boss is doing. And you can't leave the office until your boss leaves. And you have to sometimes go to the, drinking or something. So it's taking such a long time, and no women's will be to keep up with this pace. So if you're serious about labor input, you have to change the men's working time. So finally, we've got to be very serious on these issues. And many large companies have already agreed with the flex or free kind of working system. And the law has changed to provide for different incentives. So it's getting more like a performance-based labor time controls and trying to allow or even the better use for the professionals. Since the labor practice has been very much influenced by the industrial period where many people are working in factories as laborers, and still even though white collars are very much controlled by that. And so that's why the labor reforms tends to be a big issue. And also in terms of the firing people, it's only Japan and Korea that firing people by compensating certain amount of money is very difficult to do. So we are tackling with these issues. And I think if Japan succeeds, probably that is going to be a big chance for you to do that, to have more flexibilities in labor. And of course, labor unions are very unhappy about these solutions. So we have a lot of dispute over the issues. And foreigners, well, since especially nursing care for the older people, constructions and agriculture, these sectors are very much suffering from the labor shortage. So we've got to use the better use of the foreigners. So now the minimum wage is strictly imposed on every foreigners in these industries, and that is going to provide the incentives. So another issue is healthcare service. So promoting better management of medical service. I think Korea has passed quite a similar law, but you've never succeeded in passing in a diet. And now what Japan is trying to do is to promote the non-profit organization holding company among the Medicare services, so that under their holding companies, there's a hospital, there's a nursing care, or there's other services, personal services, and that's what we are trying to do. So these kind of things. And also the government is decided, since the Medicare is very well covered in Japan, people don't care about their own health. Oh, it's okay, it should be covered by insurance. Well, I don't mind. But, well, it's too sad that the insurance is too expensive. So then we are trying to do is to give some good points, or you are just in good health and trying to keep your health very good, and the government is to pay your money back. So that is another thing. And I think Korea is going to work very good in Korea too, because people are very health conscious. And it's really common for the Korean peoples to have a medical check quite often, even better than Japan. So this one. And also the promoting Medicare service uncovered by insurance, like tissue engineering, tissue-based technologies. And Japan is very much sticking to the egalitarian ideas that everybody should be treated equally. But then without that, we won't be able to have innovations in the Medicare service. So there can be a lot of, well, the progress is different. Directions is quite similar, but progress is different. But the basic ideas is getting similar. I think there should be a new industrial cooperation between Japan and Korea and aging societies. Well, probably traditional industries like traditional manufacturing. After all, it's the matter of location advantage who's going to provide the better place for the traditional manufacturing. So what we have to do is to shape up some cross-border industrial accumulation so that there should be a healthy division of labor between Japan and Korea. Otherwise, it's just ended up in just a fruitless, unproductive, cheap products competitions. And especially this is very important in the aging society because if you are the old SME president, you won't be able to go further, unlike Dr. Sagon is still going abroad. But peoples are getting weaker, so that the market integrations from geopolitical point of view is very important. And also basic science, actually Korea is doing fine, and both in medical service, robot, or new generation transportation. So it should be something based on a healthy competition. Who's going to get a better idea, who's going to implement it, who's going to win the deregulation, productive deregulations from the government, trying to compete with the vested interest group. And that's a healthy competition and healthy relationship with Japan. And there's another chances for big data analysis in Medicare service because our genes is closest between Japan and Korea. Well, no matter how the politician disputes. So if we have a big data on controlling the health, that should be good things. So we have some new frontier, but before that, we have plenty of things to do. Well, even without an EPA or FTAs, it's impossible between the bilateral countries. It's out of questions that the big data kind of frontiers is going to realize because it's very touchy and it should be very much related to the personal information anyway. So we have to start with a very low level of free trade agreement. And also we have intellectual property right protections because we have so many disputes between the two countries. And also coordinations of competition policies, especially public company reforms in Korea should be very much focused on it. And also movement of natural persons. There should be common qualifications, especially among the professional, so the talented people can move around and get a better job. And since our linguistic barriers is very low, if you just work in Japan and Korea, there should be good opportunities to use the best talents, especially among the young generation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Fukagawa, for very illuminating and interesting presentation. I don't think I need to summarize anything, but with this, why don't I invite some comments and the questions from the floor on her presentation. Yes, Dr. Kim. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Fukagawa. You dumped on us tons of materials, food for thought this morning. This is a very difficult issue. But let me step back and overall pictures. There are problems which has a certain amount of self-corrective mechanisms. But this aging problem is, if anything, is a vicious cycle. In other words, increasingly young people are avoiding to get married and have babies. And as the aging progresses further, the burden on the youth is further. The amount of people they have to support as they get old is inhibitive. And also housing costs now in Korea is happening. No longer they live with the parents, young people have to live in their own apartment, etc. And when they calculate, now how many years do I have to work from my income I can afford housings? It becomes inhibitive. So the trend here is getting increasingly delayed marriage. And by the time they get married, they're not interested in having babies. So in the scheme of this breaking away from the vicious cycle, what would you feel would be the catalyst to reverse that trend? It just showed a little bit of policy here and there. I do not believe is going to solve this big problem. Thank you.
Okay. Now why don't I invite...
Thank you very much for your good lecture. Understand that several months back that I read that the Japanese government debt to GDP exceeded 240%. And under Abenomics, that with this money supply and quantitative easing, that the government debt percentage of GDP is continued to increase. But I haven't heard that any other long-term plan how to solve this government debt problem. That 240% is the highest in the whole world. Thank you.
Okay. One more question or comment? Okay, okay, Dr. Cho, please.
Thank you, Professor Kagawa, for your presentation. But you have not mentioned much about Abenomics, I guess perhaps because of time constraint. Where is Abenomics standing these days? And what has been achieved and what is to be achieved?
Okay.
A difficult question since just to answer it in the right way. In terms of lower birth rate, I think what's something Japan has succeeded in recent days, I should say, is the cooperation with the business societies and the government. And it's not only the government who can solve everything. So in the time of Democratic Party of Japan, the relationship between the business societies and the government is just terrible. The labor union-based Minjudan, DPJ guys, try to push these business people, try to hire and try to protect the laborers as much as you can, and that is going to only to shrink the business societies. And we are now taking a different approach. And we have the business societies is actually full of ideas. How to make the better use of senior, how to make the flexible working conditions for women is not the thing that the government can control. And there is a strong consensus in Japan right now. Now, after all the disputes, that after all, in just looking up all the European countries, even the US, the women's labor participations is directly related with the birth rate coming up. So the France succeeded in because they invested so much, not probably in a very efficient way, but still they just succeeded in picking up the birth rate up until 2.0. So they just introduced the flexible working system, even though they had to compete globally, but that practical ideas, specific ideas, always come from the company side in the managerial ideas. So that the government cannot simply say that you have to hire women, you have to promote your women, you have to let the women outside of directors or something. But if companies, well, and another thing is, well, it's very important to provide the business society to think about it seriously. Otherwise, they never try to do that. It's very much path-dependent ideas. And so one thing is, if the women will be able to continue to work, they are willing to have a family, and even the poor husband, who unfortunately fired, but still he can depend on the wife's job, so that they can just continue their own living, and that's why they're tempted to have children. Then another issue is too much education cost, such a big education cost for the whole Korean family, and the return is just terrible if the son or daughter cannot find a job. And there's no countries like in Korea whose everybody, 80% goes to our universities, and it's very difficult to guarantee the decent job for everybody. So there should be, again, the good relationship with the business societies and the, especially education society, so that we can produce the good, talented people, very specialized people in responding to the labor demand. So that's why I think the common qualification among the Japan and Korea professionals seems to be a good solution, because that is going to stimulate the professionals. Oh, if I cannot find a job, I'll be probably going to somewhere, probably Japan, to do probably, now Japanese companies, for example, is desperate about English speaking, accounting skill based people. So I've been sending a lot of Korean students who's very happy about entering into the Japanese market as a so-called global human resources. So I think the relationship between the the industries and government and schools are very important to stop the low birth rate. And it's another thing is, after all, it's a movement. It's not a theory, but it's a movement like you did in a Semauru Undon. And again, after the IMF, it's a Kun Moim Undon, so collecting the money. So instead, now it's a time for Koreans to have a family movement, Kajok Undon. So, so that's why the cooperation should be comprehensive. Cooperation is very much necessary. And in terms of our budget deficit, that's something just walking in a border of collapse and the normal situations. And the situation is, after all, first, we never want to repeat another Greece, huge Greece anyway. So we can't tell a lie, keep telling lies to the market. So everybody knows the Japanese budgetary deficit is the main resources is the too much social security for the labor, for the older generation. So we have to cut it out, unfortunately. But who's going to persuade it if your elections is coming near? But the market is pressuring already. So social spending, including social security, the budgetary cut is one thing. Other thing is how to attract the foreign competitive companies into us. Japan is the country whose FDI is even smaller than North Korea. So we have to invite more foreign companies, otherwise we are going to ruin. And they're going to hopefully pay the corporate tax for us. So we have to find somebody new. And it's a game. So since the Japanese JGB is openly opened in the market, so we never know when the expectation changes in the market and the interest rate soars, and that's the end. So we have to be constantly have some prominent reform expectations towards the market, and that's our budgetary deficit issues. And the third issues of Abenomics, we are fortunate, unfortunately, in there's something in, well, the first arrow that is known by the radical quantitative easing was success, and the budgetary spending for restructuring the infrastructure, something success. Probably the first one is A, second one is B, according to Professor Hamada's assessment, and probably the third one is the battle with the vested interest rate. So as I said, the strongest vested interest in Japan is doctors, farmers, and labor union got so weaker. But since the medical care and healthcare has started to be such a focused strategic industries, we have to fight with the doctors' ideology saying that everybody should be treated equally. And some people are very much sympathetic about it. So it's all the reform. But the third arrow, you have to shoot the third arrow again and again and again. Otherwise, the expectation will collapse and will go ruin. So that's our situation. And now that is going to use up our very much political capital. And that's why, we are not very happy about Abe, frankly. But as far as the you can get a job, and as long as still it's better than DPJ, that's why we just let them go.
Thank you, Professor, for the great and comprehensive lecture. As you know, Korea and Japan have kind of a love and hate relationship, like it or not. But I think Korea really needs to thank Japan because it's really showing what to do and what not to do about 10 to 20 years ahead. So I think it's if Korea is able to learn from Japan's experience, it'll be much for the wiser and for the better. If it cannot do that, it's our own fault, I think. After all, having been shown the way, not to learn from the others' success and mistakes, it's just our own fault. In regard to the first question about how to help Korean young ladies to have more children, I actually like to propose one solution since we have a member of the National Assembly in the audience, which is to allow the foreign labor to come in to be housemaids. You know, we have example in Hong Kong where literally tens of thousands of women, especially from the Philippines, can come in to work as housemaids at a very affordable rate. In Korea, for some reason, we allow foreign labor to come in to work, but we are forced to pay higher wage for two people who are willing to work for much lower wage. So if Korea allows importation of housemaids from countries like Philippines and allow them to work for $500-600 a month, whereas Korean households are now forced to pay upwards of 2 million won for housemaid for Koreans from China or elsewhere, I think it'll become much more affordable for many working women to have housemaids at home who can also teach their children English. You know, Korean moms are crazy about their children learning English. So we have a relatively easy solution, which I think is not being implemented for whatever reason. So I just like to throw that out on the table. And that same goes for the manufacturing SMEs. You know, they should not be forced to pay these people who are willing to work for a fraction of the wage that they are being paid now. But we have this grandiose sense of human rights, which we are being forced to pay these people a much higher wage than that they are willing to work for.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I was a little bit happy that you put in your conclusion part for industrial cooperation the aspect of coordination for competition policies. But I was a little bit disappointed that you just mentioned the problem of the privatization of Korean public enterprises. Actually, I think that in the societies like Korea and Japan, as you mentioned, the problem of egalitarian idea hampers a lot the actual competition. And also, you mentioned the low level of foreign direct investment in Japan, Korea. I think that that's also based upon this competition kind of avert basic ideas of those two people. So I think that maybe it will be necessary for Japan and Korea to promote kind of accepting the ideas of others and reducing somewhat the pride of, especially in Japan, pride of kind of pride for quality of Japan, for example, accepting some foreign-made products and services that would promote kind of a new, fresh source of competition in Japan and Korea. I think that whenever I participate in the talk for kind of the free trade agreement, or as you mentioned, economic partnership agreement, etc., kind of cooperation between Japan and Korea, I raised this question about kind of the avoiding competition from abroad, not avoiding, disliking, or somewhat inner-oriented Japanese society is hampering actually real globalization of Japanese society and maybe in the future Korean society. That's my question. Thank you.
좀 한국말 하겠습니다. 그 일본에서 왜 고령화가 발생했는지, 그러니까 국민 소득이 높아지면서 필연적으로 고령화가 발생하는지 그게 궁금하고요. 연관되어서 그럼 전 세계적으로 지금 잘 살게 되고 있는데, 그럼 전 세계적으로도 고령화가 진행될 걸로 보는지. 예, 감사합니다.
I think, I'll just start with the latter questions. I think aging is two sides. One is a low birth rate, another is a longevity. And that's thanks to the innovations in all technologies in the medical care service. We tend to live longer and longer and longer. But people, if you live longer, people fear something uneasy about the future. If what will happen if our government pension fund will go bankrupt and I'm alone and I have no but so sometimes, and sustaining such a huge older generations is a very historical things because we tend to live too long these days. And in the past, people died so earlier, and there's no problem at all. And the low birth rate is a more complicated one. But if you have such a huge older generation, but you have a better birth rate, the society just maintained as they are. Well, it's only the population grows. But now, well, it's not only Korea, actually. Even in many mature economies, people tend to live longer. But you can't say that you better die earlier. So everybody wants to keep alive and healthy in healthy way. So that's why people are very ready to invest into. So it's a very innovational kind of thing. And I always talk to my students that your generation is at least will live until 100 years. So you've got to finance your 100 years of your life. So so that's out of the longevity issues, not exactly the low birth rate. So, but the question is, well, since this is a very fashionable investing areas that remains exceptionally, we are so much observed, and people are ready to pay for it. Everybody wants to get healthier and longer life. So it's a huge investment, but it's going to sustain the whole elderly societies, so that's issues. So that one thing the only thing that you can do is to keep up with the structures is just keep the birth rate minimum 2.0, maybe more than 3 or something, or to take in the immigration. And that's the major reasons, I think, for the mature economy, if we can spend much money into longevity. So, and in terms of the second issues of Japanese closeness, I think that should be quite similar with Korea too. But still, at least Korea has got so desperate, especially after the IMF crisis. You got so serious about learning English, try to go abroad, send your children to study abroad, something that should be better than Japan. But one thing that we can do is to co-host since we are integrated, at least in this global competition, you have to have the home market with population more than 100 million or more, even more, maybe 300 million or so, would be a minimum 1 unit market. Since Korea is unfortunately far smaller, so you've got to have some very deeply integrated market without almost no barrier. So maybe Japan might be the best potential because of the population, because of the closeness, anything. And probably upper part of China and the rest of Southeast Asian countries. So that should be a very good integrated market for Korea. So what we have to do is not to compete unproductively. Who's going to produce the cheaper car? Who's going to sell the better semiconductor probably? But what we had to compete is the positive pressure for the government, saying that you've got to fight with the vested interest, trying to create the better market. So that's what's already started to happen between Japan and Korea. If we pass the law to allow the NPO for the all Medicare service, your diet, I'm sure, is going to follow, saying, 일본도 하고 있는데 우리가 어떻게 못할 수가 없어. That is going to happen. And that's a very healthy competition. And we can learn each other since, thanks to a certain converging demographic structure anyway. So under the aging society, my sense is the competition who's going to produce the hardware is all done. And what we can do is to create some cross-border, huge global level industrial accumulation in manufacturing. And that's why I've been always stressing the tariff is none. We should abolish the tariff, and the movement of natural persons is more important because we have to make the best use of the younger generation who's going to be so precious for us.
Okay, the last question from Dr. Yu.
Thank you very much for your great presentation, and time is running out, so my question should be short. You mentioned the conflict between aging and the innovation-driven economy. And for innovation, you need sort of risky capital, which means the return can be very risky. So you put your money there, but you can lose all your money. But aged people don't like that kind of investment. So that's a conflict between formation of risky capital and aging. So in Korea, the government tried to make a fund called so-called growth bridge fund, and but the amount is not that big, so it's not enough. So what kind of solutions are provided in Japanese economy for solving that kind of conflict between formation of risk capital and aging, and any role of government or other means?
One thing we've been trying to do is the reform of the public pension fund, as I mentioned, so that the older people feel something easier, so that they secure their own money to put into some financial institutions so that they can invest into some riskier places. But instead, the minimum standard should be something maintained by the public fund. So even the public funds tends to be more active in terms of investment in these days, and we are serious about the governing reform of the public pension fund. And many peoples from the capital market are invited into the operations, and otherwise that should be very difficult. And we recently agreed to have a common fund with the Canadian government in terms of the public fund. So that sort of effort has been made. But the thing is, financial intermediaries has one time, we used to be, it's something similar, but it's very much Japan's used to be very much based on the bank system. And bank have the whole branches in every local corners in Japan. And bank was very much knowledgeable about which companies is doing fine. and whose the son of the president is going to be so full, so you cannot extend money for those companies. But those kind of intermediary-related information is all cut out in the restructuring. So now we are in the process of doing things, but we are at the same time very skeptical about the government fund, trying to take the the roles of venture capitals. But if there's anything that we have learned from the past histories of failure, is we finally decided to invite as much professionals as possible. So as long as the person is professional enough, even the bureaucrats dominated funds tends to be more governed by the private professionals. And I think that's almost the only way that we can survive. Or maybe since Korea is making better use of the platform, capital platform in the US, but unfortunately the US is not also working so fine in these days. But in the meantime, if they come back, probably Korea might be better benefited by global platform rather than unlike the Japanese domestic platform. But the other thing is Japan is doing is as I mentioned, the role of general trading companies. And now the Japanese trading companies are doing is more the investment banking. It's not trade. It's investment, actually. Restructuring the big companies or finding the resource investment or finding the venture companies who may grow up in the end. And the reasons why they can do is that they know quite a lot. And when the venture companies faces some, I think in terms of entrepreneurship, Korea is doing fine and everybody wants to have their own business. But the thing is, as they grow, they made a certain success and continues to grow, they tend to see their further, any kinds of limitations for further growth because you cannot find the right persons who can support you in terms of different kinds of professional people, different kinds of information, or you invented this product, who's going to be your customer? You have to do it by yourself. But what the general trading companies are doing is, okay, here it is. This customer is very happy about your product. And we just intermediate those market. So I think what the Korea is very much weaker in this intermediary functions because banks are weaker and too small to take in the whole big risks. And the business group trading houses is so much concentrated on the business group inner transactions too deeply, so they don't so much open anyway. So I think that should be the issue in just promoting Korea's venture businesses.
Thank you very much. I suppose we can go on like this all morning, but we have to stop here. 우리 푸카가오 교수께서도 이 다음에 또 우리 언론 인터뷰도 있고 해서 곧 마치겠습니다. 푸카와 교수는 우리 일본 경제도 잘 알죠. 한국 경제를 계속 팔로우업을 하고 우리 또 신문에 기고도 하고 계속 관심을 가지고 있기 때문에 이렇게 좋은 건설적인 우리가 이거 뭐 일본하고 한국은 서로 좋아하거나 싫어하거나 이사 갈 수 없잖아요. 우리 개인 같으면 이사가 버리지만은 싫으면 so we have to live together. 그러니까 so we have to find ways to collaborate and cooperate. 그래서 우리 푸카가 교수 같은 분들이 많이 나오고 우리나라의 또 교수들도 일본 이렇게 잘해서 그 politician들 좀 오히려 저기 와서 배우도록 그렇게 해야겠다. Okay, with this we have to end here. 정말 고맙습니다. 이거 영국에서 잠시 올 기회가 있는데 해서 오늘 이런 기회를 만들어서 고맙습니다. Please join me in thanking.